Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode is about social media and gang violence. It's about the amazing research of Dr. Desmond Patton. It's about 8 million tweets, cyberbanging, and using social media to get a 360-degree view of somebody's life. Desmond is an assistant professor at the Columbia School of Social Work, a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center, director of Safe Lab, and a faculty affiliate of the Social Intervention Group and the Data Science Institute. Wow. His research uses qualitative and computational data collection methods to examine how and why gang violence, trauma, grief, and identity are expressed on social media and the real-world impact they have on well-being for low-income youth of color. Dr. Patton's research on internet banging has been discussed nationally on media outlets, which include the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, USA Today, NPR, Boston Magazine, ABC News, and many, many more. Now, if that weren't enough, Desmond is also the recipient of the 2018 Early Career Achievement Award from the Society for Social Work and Research. And like most recipients of that award, Desmond has done more in his early career than most of us could possibly hope to do in our entire career. And I can't wait to see what Desmond does next. Desmond and I spoke in January of 2017. He unpacked the complex relationship between gangbanging and cyberbanging, which is a term he and his colleagues coined back in 2013. We also talked about how social workers can think about the relationship between social media and youth. Desmond encourages us to think of the online world as a new social environment that social workers need to understand. He questions existing agency policies that prohibit social workers from interacting with clients on social media and asks if those policies are empirically sound. And one of the things that I love most about Desmond's work is that he combines the rich understanding that comes from qualitative research and the cutting-edge insights that can come from analyzing big data. If you want to hear Desmond and I talk more about technology and social work practice, you can check out the video that we made when I was at Columbia University giving the 2017 Austin lecture. The link is on the website. Now, before we get to this awesome interview, I want to give a big shout out to some of the amazing folks who generously donated their time to transcribe episodes of the Social Work Podcast. I'd like to thank the future Dr. Rashida Edwards and Dedrick Perkins, social work student at the Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work at the University of Oklahoma, for transcribing the 3-part series on the 2018 Code of Ethics that came right before this episode. Other rock stars in the Social Work Podcast Village who generously donated their time to transcribe episodes are Anastasia Jenkins, MSW from Dallas, Texas; Kendra Wagner, MSW and American Association of Suicidology Certified Crisis Counselor and a Forensic Specialist; Ferd Palumbo, MSW, LSW, who's a clinician at the YWCA of Bergen County Healing Space in Hackensack, New Jersey; and Ian M. Danielson, LCSW, Assistant Professor, the Social Work Program, Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. Informally, he was the director of the Greater Richmond SCAN, which is Stop Child Abuse Now Child Advocacy Center in Richmond, Virginia. If you're thinking, hey, I love those transcripts, I'm so glad those people did them, and you want to donate one, just send me an email. And if you want to join the community of listeners on Twitter and Facebook, just Google Social Work Podcast and Twitter or Facebook. And we're doing an audience survey, and I would love to get your feedback about what you like and what you don't like. And the link is on the top right of the Social Work Podcast website. And if you love the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. The more positive 5-star reviews, the easier it is for people to find the podcast. And now, without further ado, on to episode 116 of the Social Work Podcast, Social Media and Gang Violence. an interview with Desmond Patton. All right, Desmond, thanks so much for being here on the podcast and talking with us today. How did you get involved in this work?
So about 4 years ago, I was doing youth violence research in Chicago, and I had stayed in contact with the young men that are part of my dissertation study. And many of them made me aware of some interactions that were happening on Twitter. In particular, there were two very well-known rappers from Chicago that were in a beef. They were arguing back and forth on Twitter. And one individual in particular identified himself on Twitter, made himself very clear to the community, and was kind of fed up with the beef that was happening, and basically said, well, if you want to do something about this, let's meet at this particular location. And so on Twitter, he identified a location, and he wanted the other rapper to meet him there. And lo and behold, within 3 hours, that rapper was killed in that exact location. And so that began my interest in the use of social media as a way to understand gang violence and root causes of violence. And from that, it became really clear to me that social media is a tool, and that it's not about why gang members use social media, but everyone is using social media to express themselves, to build community, to talk with friends. But what's different is the context in which that communication is embedded in. And when young people are embedded in a culture or a community where violence is pervasive and a part of their day-to-day life, then that becomes the content for which they narrate in these online spaces.
So one of the terms that I've heard is cyber banging or internet banging. Can you tell us what that is? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my colleagues Rob Eshman and Dirk Butler, we wrote a paper in 2013 called Internet Banging, in which it's a conceptual paper in which we try to describe a computer-mediated communication in which young people who have some type of gang affiliation, whether they're hardcore gang members or on the periphery, are using social media to taunt, to make threats, through the use of emojis and hashtags and videos and images. And that conversation, those interactions on social media have the propensity to lead towards real world violence. And so oftentimes what happens is there is a post made. Someone perhaps is disrespecting an individual that was killed by a rival gang. And then the different gangs or factions then are commenting on that particular post, and they're going back and forth. But because of the context in which these young people are embedded in, they can't just leave it there, because now that post is visible. Thousands or hundreds of people are now looking at that post. Everyone's getting emotional. And now they have to prove themselves. So if they've made a comment online, they have to back it up. If you don't back it up, that could make you more susceptible to violence or injury. And so now they need to take it offline in order to maintain that code of the street. There's been one example that has really stuck out in my mind. For the past few years, I've been studying one female deceased gang member, Jakira Barnes. And what was most interesting about Jakira is that she was a female gang member that was known as a shooter. And it's not uncommon for young women to be a part of gangs, but it is uncommon for young women to be active shooters in gangs. And so not only did she have this positionality as a shooter, but she also had a very prominent space on Twitter. She was very well known on Twitter. She had over 27,000 tweets, 5,000 followers, which put her in the 98th percentile of all Twitter users. And I learned a lot about her. I became aware of her through popular media. In 2014, many popular media outlets wrote about Jakira, calling her the teen queen of gangland Chicago. And many variations of that. And they talked about her brutal nature, her willingness to shoot at the drop of a hat, and her communicating many of these ideas and threats on Twitter. And so I initially became interested in her because I wanted to see to what extent can I find keywords and phrases that help me understand what led her to make these types of comments on Twitter. But when I dug deeper with my research team, we actually found something much more interesting. Which is actually quite sad. We were asking the wrong questions. We forgot that this was a young woman, a girl, a human that has fears and pain and trauma and stress just like everyone else. And when we dug deeper into her Twitter data, we saw someone that was expressing an immense amount of pain. So she would say things like, the pain is unbearable following one of her good friends allegedly shot by the Chicago Police Department. She would say phrases like this often. And then the next day, you would see something a bit more aggressive. So you could see her grief becoming anger. But then there would be people who were from the opposing gang who were looking at her vulnerability, her willingness to express herself like this on social media. And then they would make comments to her. And then being the person that she is, she would make comments back. So this kind of back and forth would evolve. But what was most important is that the initial comment was around pain and grief. The initial comment was not around aggression or threats. And that's what has been missing in our discussion around this link between social media and gang violence, in that we are forgetting the human element, and that there is a person, there is an experience, there are a set of events that trigger aggression and threats. It doesn't start there.
So that was such a kind of a compelling and moving story. You uncovered that this person had pain and that there was a multidimensionality to her experience. Does your research on social media and these gangs really delve into the sadness, the depression, the trauma, the kinds of things that I think a lot of social workers deal with on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the great things about being a qualitative researcher is that we go where the participant takes us. And on social media, that can go many different places. And that can be really wild and can be really exciting. What I've done is try to track the story that is emerging from day to day, from week to week. And with young people, just like other folks, but particularly with young people, they go through a host of emotions throughout the week that is dependent on, what happened at school, what happened in the community. And so, for example, on one day, the content might be heavy and very sad and very traumatic. And oftentimes that is driven, that is driven by the offline context. What people oftentimes don't understand or not think through is social media communication is rooted in offline context. And so the experiences, the events, the situations that young people go through are essentially just expressed on these social media platforms. And so some days that's about trauma and about grief and about pain. And other days it's about love and happiness and excitement and all the beautiful things that are happening in one's life. I published a paper in Violence and Victims where we looked at 8 million posts from gang-involved folks in Detroit. What we realized is only 4% of the communication from those folks, those 8 million tweets, were about crime and violence. And so that kind of flies in the face of the narratives that we get about young people and young people from marginalized spaces, and that their communication, their activity, their engagements around violence and crime, they were actually talking about a host of other things. They were using these platforms as a promotive space, just like everyone else. But what's important is that although only 4% of the communication was around violence and crime, that 4% was quite threatening and aggressive. And because of the context in which these young people are embedded in, they would move on those comments as well.
Did you look and see what percentage of the tweets had to do with, say, love or infatuation or romance?
What was interesting is that we were trying to learn more about violence and crime, and we thought, our hypothesis is that we would find more conversations and exchanges around violence and crime, and that was not the case. And so we weren't looking for happiness and love and excitement, and that's what was there. That is the primary content that was in the Twitter feed that we scraped.
I can understand why you would be looking at violence because, the outcome of romantic interactions on a Twitter feed is kind of personal. It's intimate. It doesn't hurt anybody. And so it, in essence, like the things that we think of as good and positive and pro-social, the outcomes are almost invisible. It's these very small percentage of the communications that become public and become the things that we then focus on.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that there are folks out here saying, oh, that's really interesting, but I am not going to be analyzing 8 million tweets, right? So what are some of the take-home points here for practitioners?
First, I think that practitioners should understand that social media is a new environmental context for understanding behavior and adaptation and trauma and stress and love and happiness. It is ripe for the kind of work that social workers do day in and day out. But first, we need to realize that it is an important context, and we need to move beyond our fear around the use of technology in practice. I teach social workers at Columbia, and on the first day of class, I asked them, how many of you all have a Twitter account? And most of my students are 22, 23, and maybe out of a class of 25, 2 or 3 hands will raise. And ask how many people may have a Facebook account. Maybe there are more hands. But they're using social media for personal interactions, or they're using social media to follow celebrities. And I think one thing that we need to wrap our minds around as social workers is that many of the communities that we are working in have some life on social media, whether it's young people, older people, young adults. They are expressing and narrating their life online, and oftentimes in very vulnerable ways, and they're presenting multiple selves. So you'll get a school self, a personal self, a professional self, a silly self. And so it gives you a kind of 360 perspective of one's identity and how they are expressing that identity online. And so it gives you a nice kind of entree into someone's world that might be challenging to get in a one-to-one interview. In the work that I do, I interview young people all the time, and it's really hard to get this level of vulnerability. I think, interviewing a young person around pain and trauma, young people who live in Chicago and some of the toughest neighborhoods in the city, have never been as expressive as I have seen them be on Twitter. And I think that was the moment that I realized that this medium is more powerful than we realized. And so I think that we also need to think about, what is the role of technology and social media at the organizational level? Oftentimes, an organization may have a policy around interaction or engagement with their clients on social media. And I think that we need to think about whether or not that is an empirically sound policy. Are we missing whole swaths of information, data, context that can help us do our job better? And so I think for social work practitioners and students, I think the first step is to become aware that this is an important context, and B, start to engage these platforms from a different perspective. So instead of following a celebrity, think about what you're reading. What are you taking into when you're on social media? Sit for a day and just do some observations. Take some field notes. Sit with one individual and kind of note what they are talking about, the pictures that they're uploading, and see if you can tell a story about that individual. And what might you glean from that type of experience?
So it sounds like you're almost suggesting that we need to rethink the way that we think about our clients and the data that we get from clients. Would it be reasonable to say that you would advocate for maybe getting permission from clients to read their public Twitter feed, for example, if they have them? Like if you're working with an adolescent and during your intake assessment or your first couple sessions, say, hey, are you on Twitter? Yeah. Is that an important place for you? Yeah. Would you be okay if I was checking out your Twitter feed? Like, is that something that you think could be useful? I realize there are a lot of red flags that go up, especially if somebody thinks, oh, well, my social worker is reading my Twitter feed, therefore I can communicate via Twitter with my social worker. But it almost sounds like you're saying this is a really important piece of information, and it provides a 360 view of our clients, which we can't get otherwise. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a really important question, a really complicated question. I think that it's important for social workers to maintain trust and rapport building with their clients. And I think that at any point of getting additional information, that the social worker should enter into a conversation with the client around what information is helpful and valid, and what are issues around privacy and trust that need to be bridged. But then conversely, we also know that there may be conditions that are not necessarily tied to an individual. So for example, there may be times when there are external events, offline situations that are happening in the community or surrounding an individual, but not necessarily tied to that individual. So that may be, in one's neighborhood, there have been a series of robberies, and you've learned that by sitting on Twitter and looking at various hashtags that are indicated, in which a neighborhood is indicated, and that information may help you contextualize one of your clients that is from that neighborhood, but it's not getting their individual information. And so we have to think about, the different micro and macro levels of information that we can glean from social media. And so I would think that A, we need to first have conversations, but B, we need to also think about broader context and broader implications that we can glean from social media that may not need to be around the individual client, but more so around the ecological system.
So it's been really interesting starting out talking about gang violence and use of Twitter, as a way of identifying where a crime might happen. And then talking about Twitter as a tool and social media as a tool that teenagers are using to communicate all sorts of things in their lives. And then also to think about Twitter, social media as a way of understanding the broader context for things that are happening online and offline in a teenager's life. And so it sounds like you understand social media really as this way of understanding and providing information about not just a specific event or a specific tweet, but really the context for a kid's life.
Absolutely. But I think that it's important to think about ethics and the ethics involved in this work. One thing that I've learned in this research is that it is easy to misinterpret what young people are saying. There is a complex and nuanced form of language that is embedded in youth culture, in one's neighborhood, one's block, one's gang affiliation. And if you're not from that particular neighborhood or community, you may misinterpret what is actually being said. And what happens when that misinterpretation happens is young people of color are further marginalized and policed because of their communication. And so I think that it's really important to think about, how do we make sure that we have an accurate understanding of the language, the context, and the culture that is being expressed on social media, and how do we privilege the voices of young people in this space? And so in my own research, I hire young people from Chicago to be research assistants in my lab, and they translate and interpret the data to help me understand the full context, or as close as we can get to the full understanding. That way, if we are saying that a particular set of tweets or posts are aggressive, that young people who are from that community have validated that particular label, and that it's not a label that comes out of thin air. Because some of the challenges around this space is that oftentimes the police may use this type of data, and it's used to surveil communities of color. What we want to do in the work that I'm a part of is leverage expertise from community members and youth to best support the needs that they articulate online. And I think that that is a great space for social workers, is to continue to build relationships with community members and youth, and using social media as a meeting place to understand each other, to understand needs that are expressed, and to think about various points of entryway, maybe perhaps new interventions or prevention strategies that come out of conversations around social media that get us closer to needs for youth and communities.
Do you have for example, about a tweet or series of tweets that were misinterpreted?
Yeah. So one of the issues that we have is interpreting rap lyrics. And I remember when I first started doing this research, and there were a number of posts that on the face to me and my team looked very aggressive and threatening. But then I commenced to doing a research study with gang-involved youth from Chicago, and I presented these tweets, and I said, I think these tweets are really aggressive. Do you know what's happening in these tweets? And they laughed at me, and they were very clear to say, can't you tell this is a rap lyric? And, the guy was probably on the L headed home, and he was listening to Kendrick Lamar or whomever else, and they posted that lyric on Twitter, and it means nothing. And so my quick assumption that was embedded in my own kind of biases around language and music could be quite problematic. But when I talked to young people, they gave me a different understanding and a different approach to this content that really changed the direction of how I do this work. So now we're very clear on assessing the severity of content, right? And so we do a lot of checks on our interpretations of the data to make sure that, do we really think that this particular comment is threatening? And let's analyze it to see to what extent we think this is a high-level threat, a medium-level threat, a low-level threat, and let's provide some justifications around this based on our understanding and youth understanding of what we think is actually aggressive on social media.
Desmond, thank you so much for being here on the Social Work Podcast and talking with us today about your work with social media and young kids. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.